man, or why man would take a piece of wood or a stone, carve it into what they think is a god, and then pray to it. It's like you're praying to something you just made. How, how would you do that? But anyway, that's obviously the idols and false gods. Continue our point. In our study here in Peter, and in our review of prayer, the term refers to communication or attempted communication with God. So we're narrowing it down in our study where we're just going to be talking about praying to God. And we're going to narrow it even further here in a couple points where we're going to talk about effective prayer. And so it's not going to just be communication and or attempted communication. It's going to be communication because it's going to be effective. But we'll get there in just a second. Point 2. Prayer is actually communication from the soul of the believer to God, and therefore can be accomplished without the need of voice, special posture, or special location, period. See, there are many denominations that teach that you have to pray aloud. You don't have to pray aloud. There are some denominations that teach you have to have a certain posture. There is, posture is represented in the Catholic Church, for example. When I grew up, you had kneelers, which were these things that folded down from the back of pews, right? And you would stand, you would kneel, you would sit based on where you were in the various parts of the liturgy, and the mass. Okay, not the liturgy, but the mass. Okay, that would indicate that somehow that posture was representative of some kind of royal or special requirement for prayer or function, and it isn't. Okay, neither is it important that you pray in a particular place. Many houses, particularly in the Hispanic community, for example, have alcoves that are set aside for prayer. Right? Well, you may want to have that for privacy, but it's not mandatory. Okay, that's the point here. Continuing the point. In addition, prayer is supposed to be an extremely personal communication to God So prayer is supposed to be an extremely personal communication to God that reflects the immediate tactical status and desires of the individual believer, semicolon. Therefore, comma, anytime we use someone else's prayers that have been dictated to us, we're failing to perform the function of prayer as God has designed it for his family. See, again, being raised Catholic, that was one of the big things. They had certain prayers that you needed to memorize. You needed to memorize the Apostle Creed. You needed to memorize, Our Father, right? The Lord's Prayer as they have it, which is slightly different than the Protestants have it. And of course, the big one was you had to memorize Hail Mary, right? And when you would do the Rosary, okay, you would start off, and the beads on the Rosary indicate which prayer you're supposed to be doing, right? As you walked around the Rosary. The cross at the first part of the Rosary started with the Apostles' Creed, and then you worked on from there, okay? And you went around the beads. And if you were in a time crunch, what happened is you got to be where you could recite that prayer very quickly. And all it is it's just rote recitation, right? It's not prayer in any way, shape, or form. It's not even concentrating on God in many cases. It's just getting through some kind of some kind of a punishment, if you will, for whatever it was you did, right? When you go and talk to the priest and say, I committed this kind of sin, he'd say, yeah, say, 25 Hail Marys, give the church $500 and you'll be absolved, right? And so you go in there, Hail Mary, full of grace, mother, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. And you just go zoom right through them, right? It means nothing. Okay, I haven't done a rosary in 40 years. Not quite 40, but a long time. Still took me a second there to gin it up. But yeah, you can memorize it, and you just whip right through it, right? Because you had 5 Hail Marys and Our Father, and then you would do a Station of the Cross, and you had 5 more Hail Marys and Our Father, and Station of the Cross, right? And you just go all the way around that, and you do that 7 times. You get done, and you've got the rosary. Okay, maybe it was 10 times. Anyway, 7, I think. Anyway. I haven't done a rosary in a long time, as I said. It's not that, we're supposed to recite any prayers that are dictated to us. One last sentence, okay? Now, this means that we should always, and you can capitalize or underline or make italics or whatever, somehow emphasize always. This means that we should always teach our children how to pray, and not what to pray, or have them memorize prayers. So if you want to talk memorization is for verses. Memorizations is so that you can properly use, okay, sure, Paul. My mind just went blank. Pardon me? No, so you can get started with the faith rest technique. There we go. Boy, I'm losing it. Anyway, no. So the one of the reasons you want to have memorization is so you can use the faith rest technique. Because the first thing you do in a faith rest technique is you have memorization of a verse, right? You can bring it up and it starts your mind working. It's like kickstarting an engine, right? When some big pressure hits you, a lot of times it'll put you into a mode where you just really can't think. It's like, oh my gosh, I wasn't expecting this. I can't think, right? Well, that's why you have these verses memorized, because then you can bring up a verse. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God, right? You can get these verses going and you can get your mind, moving, right? And then once your mind is moving and then you can start applying doctrine, you can start using prayer. But the prayer isn't something that's memorized. The prayer is something that's specific for that piece of or that circumstance at that moment. See, so it's not go memorize prayers, it's memorize verses that are going to help you with faith rest technique, that are going to help you recall doctrines, that are going to help you recall plans of attack, if you will, that you've used, and set aside scenarios that you've set aside and laid aside for specific pressures and problems, and how you would use those doctrines. Okay, so as always, as a parent, you're supposed to teach your children not what to pray, not give them a book of common prayer, okay, and have them memorize all the prayers in the book of common prayer, but instead give them the capability to understand how to pray and what they should be doing in praying, and therefore they can make the prayers personal like they're supposed to be. Point 3. We use the term, quote, effective prayer, end quote, to mean a prayer that is properly addressed and formatted, comma, has biblically acceptable content, and is properly offered to God the Father without regard to the answer it will receive. As an example of an ineffective prayer, we have Psalm 66:18, which is offered while the believer is harboring sin in his right lobe. I'm going to give you examples of positive ones as we go through the rest of the review. But I wanted to give you an example of an improper one, because a lot of people believe that a prayer is prayer, and prayer is prayer. Okay, the idea is that prayer requires proper format. Prayer requires proper process and activity. You have to be in fellowship. You have to address it properly. You have to pray properly. Okay, there are many things that can keep prayer from not getting to God in the first place. Okay, as Jack used to say, go no higher than the overhead, meaning that it stays inside this room, and those people that heard it and nobody else hears it, including God. Okay, that isn't an effective prayer. So we're talking about effective prayer, prayer that God hears, that's properly formatted, has a proper biblical content. You don't pray, like Jack say, faith rest a bank robbery. You don't pray, okay, for success in doing something illegal. Okay. Lord, grant us the wisdom to fool this teller into believing that I'm actually somebody else while I rob this bank. That sounds ridiculous, but many people at a lower level, okay, that's ridiculous because we all understand crime, but many people at a lower level will pray for things that are unbiblical. We have, pick on an obvious one, we now have gay marriage ceremonies performed by, quote, the clergy, end quote. I'm sure there's prayer involved in those. That prayer's not going anywhere. That's prayer for something that's unbiblical. They think it's biblical, don't know why, but it's unbiblical. Right? So even if the format's perfect, they're addressing it to God the Father. They started off in fellowship. They don't get very far. Okay. But the idea is that that's prayer for something that's unbiblical. Okay. So it's got to have all of those components. It's got to have content. It's got to have a process. Okay. Point 4. Prayer is the believer's dynamic, tactical connection with God and God's plan of grace, period. It is the mechanic that the believer must use, and you can underline must, that the believer must use to access all of the fantastic promises and protections inherent in God's plan for his life, period. How do you operate in life? How do organizations operate in life? One of the biggest things that has to happen is communication, right? Marriages fall apart mostly because of what? Lack of communication. whether it's lack of communication about finances, about, about children, about, all kinds of things. It all boils down to, as a primary reason, one of the primary reasons, lack of communication, right? How does a believer fall apart? Lack of communication. Doesn't communicate to God. Doesn't receive communication back. Doesn't recognize when he's receiving communication back because he's not in the proper frame of reference to understand it when it comes back, right? God communicated to us, first of all, in his word, giving us the frame of reference to understand everything else. Then we communicate to him our desires, our appreciations, our thanksgiving, okay, our concerns. And then he communicates back by the, quote, opening of doors and the closing of doors, by the things that are immediately provided for us or immediately denied us. No, not now. You're not ready for it. No, you'll never be ready for it. That isn't for you. Yes, do that. Yes, that's what I want you to do. Here, I've shown you this. I make this available to you. It's not a verbal response coming back from God. It's having the sensitivity, the frame of reference through our doctrinal understanding to see the things that happen, to perceive, to understand when we're getting answers back. And to get the knowledge out of the word. The classes that we have, the books that I teach, okay, are as a result of having sensitivity to what we need, to what I believe God is leading me to teach. Okay, we spent a lot of time in the Pauline epistles. I could very well have gone, and stayed in the Pauline epistles. They're the majority of the New Testament, right? Could have continued Corinthians. We were in the middle of 2 Corinthians. Okay, when there was a change of leadership. But sensitivity, my prayers, things like that, I'm trying to relate to you. Okay, my understanding was we needed some application. We just gone through a changing event of the church. We needed to understand the application. We needed to understand the doctrines that we had been given, all of the doctrines that Jack had given us, that we had applied. We needed to have more focus on application. That was James. We have the same thing here with Peter. James set us up right for Peter. Peter, in this first opening paragraph, was giving us all these doctrines. We couldn't have studied Peter without having those doctrines first and having had the Pauline epistles. We couldn't have studied James and understood what that sanctification was without being mature believers. But God didn't come down and write on a notepad for me, okay, when you get done with this, I need you to study, Peter. I didn't have it in a vision, where I'm flipping through the Bible and it stops on Peter. It's a result of being perceptive, understanding, having doctrine. You have the same capabilities in your lives. You look around, you understand, you see these things. That's the communication. It has to go both ways. It's a monologue. You're monologuing to God. He's not talking to you, but you're getting your answers back. Okay? And if you don't have that communication, just like the marriage that's going to fall apart without communication, you don't have that communication, you're going to go, pew. You're not going to develop that personal love relationship with God, just like the wife doesn't have the personal love relationship with the husband or vice versa. Because you don't understand. The communication's not open. And if you're out of fellowship all the time, when you're praying, when you pray, you're going to have ineffective prayers, or even if you have effective prayers and the answer is no, you're going to go, gee, God doesn't love me. I'm going to go off, find something else. I'm going to go worship crystals. Move up to Sedona. Okay. I'm going to join some other faith. I'm going to become a Muslim, whatever. Okay, Buddhist. No, you've got to have that communication open. And this is our communication path. So prayer is a believer's dynamic, tactical connection with God and his plan and God's plan of grace. It is the mechanic that the believer must use to access all the fantastic promises and protections inherent in God's plan for his life. If the believer doesn't learn to use and appreciate effective prayer then he will fail to see God's plan and protection, and may be weakened to the point that he can be persuaded by Satan and his cosmic system that God's plan is just an empty promise. You will know someone in your life, okay, at some point in time. You may have already experienced it. If you haven't, I almost guarantee you will experience individuals who are believers, who started off positive, okay, and then they chucked it all. They threw it all away. Why did they throw it all away? All away. If they thought it was effective for them, they wouldn't throw it away, right? People stop taking medication because they figure they don't need it. It's not doing anything for them. But if you're a severe asthmatic and you take medication and that's what allows you to breathe, okay, you don't quit it. You don't just say, okay, I'm going to quit taking this medication because you're going to die. Okay, well, it's the same thing with Bible doctrine. But what happens is these individuals, they don't see that it's effective. It's like the individual, you know, the bipolar individual who has to take medication in order to not be bipolar. But then when they're on their medication, they think, well, gee, I'm normal. I don't need to take this medication. And so they stop taking it, and then they become bipolar again, right? That's the believer that starts off as a believer, okay, functioning properly, but doesn't pray, doesn't know, you know, starts off functioning properly, but allows his prayer life to go, doesn't pray, doesn't keep up the communication with God, therefore doesn't see the miracles that God's providing, doesn't have God's protection, gets beat up all the time, partly, mostly as a result of discipline. God's allowing that beating up, okay? And what's he do? Rather than turning around and saying, wow, I got to get back on my medicine, I got to get back on my doctrine, okay, I got to get back into my prayer life, it says it doesn't work. And then, pew, he's gone, or she's gone. Like I say, if you haven't met someone like that, hopefully I'm explaining something that you've seen before, but if you haven't seen it, more than likely you probably will. It happens. That's one of Satan's wonderful tools, is he gets people to think that, gee, what an idiot, you were duped. God's plan doesn't work. And the person, because they're not perceptive enough to see God's plan, because they don't have a very active prayer life, they fall for that. They say, you know what, that's right. I prayed for this and I prayed for that and it didn't happen. Well, you didn't pray properly, or you prayed and the answer was no. One of the two. And you didn't understand that. You didn't figure out how to interpret that. Because why? Because you're not in fellowship, because you're not functioning properly, because you don't have a good prayer life. And pew, off you go. So that's how Satan gets people away, right? Like I say, it's just like the medicine, right? You know, I'm not going to take this medicine because it's not doing me any good. Yeah, it was doing you good, right? You know, and they don't realize it until what? Many cases until they die. That's exactly the same thing with a believer. They have they have a discipline and to the point of the sin unto death, and then all of a sudden they wake up, okay, and they look around and they go, holy cow, I'm an interim body. Maybe I should have done something, you know, that would have had a lot more reward and a little bit better status here, you know, and life would have been a little bit better if I had continued to function properly. So anyway, it gets to the point where Satan and his cosmic system can convince the individual that God's plan is just an empty promise. Point 5. The believer is to continually manifest or demonstrate his capacity and time to God the Father through prayer. This, in fact, is the defense against Satan's argument. First John 5, 14 and 15, compared with 1 John 2, 15 through 17. So remember when we studied the progression through maturity, one of the things that we studied was the fact that, as Paul stated in Corinthians, that you are not going to be tested or tempted beyond your capabilities. And that with the temptation, God always provides a solution to it, right? So when you're a baby believer, and you're praying and you haven't really learned a lot about prayer, the prayers that you're praying, we know from 1 John 1:9, he's going to take care of the sins that you didn't know were sin, which are many when you're a baby believer, okay, as well as the sins that you've forgotten, which will probably be many as a baby believer because you're not keeping short accounts, right? And in the meantime, when you're functioning properly, God puts up that wall of fire. God puts up the protection and only allows those things that you can handle to come to you. Everything else is deflected. But as you grow, okay, you can think of it as as opposed to a wall of fire, you can think of it as a great big concrete wall, right? You know, that's 3 feet thick, right? And as you grow, that wall gets thinner and thinner and more porous. Not because God wants these things to rip you down, okay, but because he knows you have the capability to handle them. Because your prayer life is increasing, your understanding of doctrine is increasing, your knowledge of sin is increasing, your knowledge of salvation, your knowledge of angelology, your knowledge of all of the things that we talk about in theology is increasing. And you can handle these things, okay? Up to and including, finally, the point where God, like he did to Job, God can say to Satan, take your best shot. That believer has everything necessary. You can do anything you want to him except kill him. And you have all of the power and all of the knowledge and everything necessary when functioning properly to handle those kinds of attacks, right? And that comes as a result of a proper and active prayer life as you manifest to God that you have this knowledge that you can handle that. Otherwise, you're stuck in that baby believer mode, right? Where God has got to protect you from everything. Right? You got to have the light sockets covered and the everything put up where you can't reach it, and all the stoves got to always be turned off, and the stairs have to be padded, and all of those kinds of things, right? I can remember when Andrea, we had a 2-story house when Andrea was a baby, right? Our little girl. And one of the things Andrea used to do, she wasn't quite a baby, but she was, a little bit older. But one of the things she had figured out was that she could actually lay on the stairs and straighten herself out and slide down the stairs. She'd pick her head up so she wouldn't hit her chin, right? And she would like do a belly flop right down the stairs, right? It was like, okay, I guess we don't have to have the baby gate anymore, right? Figure that one out. But God is going to protect you, right? And until you get to the point where, you can handle it. How does he know? I mean, he knows because he's omnipotent, but how does he know you know? Okay. He knows you know when you manifest it by prayer, letting him know your capacities, letting him know. See, don't expect God to know and function on it just because you know it. You have to pray about it. Let him know you know. Okay, that's part of it. Okay. Point 6. The most important and often least stated purpose for prayer is the continual exhale of the believer priest's capacities to God the Father. We know from our study is the continual exhale of the believer priest's capacities to God the Father. We know from our study of the divine decree that there never was a time when God didn't perfectly know our capacities, every moment of our existence in time. I mean, God knows our capacities, okay? So why do you have to tell him? Well, here's the next sentence. However, because of the divine decree, comma, the angelic conflict, comma, and the fact that our volition is the major issue, it is necessary for each individual to exhale his or her capacities to God the Father on a regular basis in prayer, period. See, God the Father knows this, but we need to exhale it. We need to use prayer to tell him, that we understand that we have these capacities as well, right? To acknowledge those capacities so that you have this communication. And again, it's kind of really setting the baseline between the two of you so that you both know exactly where you stand. I had a presentation at work that we're trying to present at a symposium this coming week. Okay, in order to present it at a symposium, we have to have, because it's on a government contract, we have to have a permission for public dissemination. Okay, from the government, and then once we get that, we have to have the same thing internally. I had to fill out, so I had to get a public release notice, is what it's called, a public release authorization, from the government, and then I could fill out all the paperwork internally to get a public release authorization from General Dynamics in order to do it, right? In doing this, I got log jammed in the process. Anyway, I had to call the import-export. It goes through a whole bunch of different organizations. One happens to be import-export, to make sure that we're not giving away information to foreigners that aren't supposed to have it, right? So I had to, and so the import-export lawyer is supposed to review it, right? So I called, and trying to kind of hand walk this through, if you will, because it got stuck logjam. I had to call the import-export lawyer. Well, I've known the import-export lawyer for about 30 years. Okay, so I called them up and I said, we have this presentation that's log jammed, right? And it's going to come to you for authorization. I'd like to make sure that you're prepped and know that it's coming. And he said, I've known you for a long time, Paul. I'm sure you got the authorization from the government first, right? And I said, of course, it's attached. You'll see it. And he goes, that's what I thought. And he goes, I knew you'd have it, but I had to ask. That's my job. He said, so I'll keep my eyes out when it comes. I'll go ahead and review it real quickly and I'll move it forward, right? But it's like this. He's known me for a long time. He knows that I'm going to follow the processes, right? And that I would never submit it without first having all of the boxes checked, right? And everything, right? So the way he said it, I've known you for a long time. I know you've got the approval from the Army, right? He still had to ask, right? Well, it's the same thing we're doing with God. God knows what our capacities are. In this case, he doesn't have to ask. He doesn't have to do the right? But he has to hear you say it. He has to hear you say, yes, I have these capacities, and I'm going to exercise these capacities, and I want more and greater capacity. That's what prayer is for. Okay? So, each individual to exhale his or her capacities to God the Father on a regular basis in prayer. That was the end of the sentence that you guys got, right? Okay, subpoint A. The reason is simple, colon. So the reason is simple, colon. The believer's individual capacity at any given moment in time reflects both the doctrine that he has used his volition to ingest and the doctrine that he has used his that he has used his volition to apply. Period. First Corinthians 3, 11 through 15. That's, of course, building on the foundation. Okay, so 1 Corinthians 3, 11 through 15. Our study in 1 Peter is telling us that we are all evaluated by God continually on this basis, period. In other words, he's not a respecter of persons, but a respecter of how his word is being received and used. So it's the doctrine that we ingest and the doctrine that we imply. Subpoint B. At the point of salvation, every believer receives everything positionally necessary for blessing, period. So at the point of salvation, every believer receives everything positionally necessary for blessing. This is represented by our term quote, positionally sanctified or set apart, period, end quote. The only thing that stops God from giving the believer tactical blessing in time is the believer's lack of doctrinally developed capacity. So the only thing that stops God from giving the believer tactical blessing in time is the believer's lack of doctrinally developed capacity. Without capacity for blessing, it is impossible for God to bless the believer because that, quote, blessing, end quote, would cause the believer misery and unhappiness. Period. It would not be blessing, but cursing. James 4, 2 and 3. We studied that before. The idea is if you don't have the capacity to receive something, receiving it is going to be disastrous, right? It's like being promoted above your capabilities. Right? Being promoted above your capabilities is not a true promotion. It's misery. Not knowing what you're supposed to be doing, not knowing how to function, not knowing how to lead, having the ridicule associated with that, having the pressures associated with trying to succeed in something you don't even know how to do. Right? All of that is horrible, but yet there are people who want to be promoted they just want the money, but they don't have the skills to be promoted, right? You don't ever want to do that. You don't ever want to receive something you're not ready for, right? Again, I haven't made a movie analogy in a long time. I'll make a movie analogy. There's a movie that Steve Martin was in a long, long time ago. Okay, that was based on Cyrano de Bergerac. Okay, and it was called what's that? Roxanne. Thank you, Roxanne. And he was a fireman. Okay, he was a fire chief actually, and he takes over this fire company that is just it's like the Keystone Cops. It's disastrous, right? And so what we have here is these firemen who don't have the capacity to be firemen. And it's hilarious when you're watching them, right? But in real life, it would have been just these people would have just been, it would have been disastrous, right? It would have been disastrous for the city to have this fire department that didn't even know how to, get a cat down from a tree, and it was disastrous to the firemen themselves who didn't know how to hold the fire hose. And when they let go of the pressure, they kind of shot them up into the air, right? And landed them up inside a tree, right? That's what I think of when I think about, promotion beyond your capability or getting blessing that you're not ready to handle. It's like that guy that's got the fire hose, right? And he grabs it and he goes to let the water out and he doesn't know what he's doing and he goes flying backwards and slams into the wall. It's not blessing. Okay, and that's what we have here. Blessing without capacity is disastrous. Subpoint C, this is the last subpoint, and it makes us ready for point 7, which actually is the last point, but we won't have time for it today. Anyway, subpoint C, therefore, gosh darn it, the believer must develop capacity through the perception, acceptance, metabolization, and application of doctrine in order for blessing to be true blessing. This includes and in fact necessitates the proper use of prayer, and the development of effective prayers. This then is, quote, operational sanctification, or being set apart in application, period, end quote. So that's what Peter's been talking about. Yeah, I'm sorry, what?
I didn't get that.
Okay. I said, this is then, quote, operational sanctification or being set apart in application, period, end quote, or in practice, however you want to put that. And this, of course, is what Peter's been talking about in this first part of verse 17. And point 7 is going to be the last point. And in point 7, we're going to get into that first part of next week. And point 7 is going to be the five-piece format for proper prayer. Okay, so you can guess there's going to be 5 subpoints. So it's going to be point 7. We're going to get down through subpoint E, and then we'll get back into the exegesis and review or study, not review, the exegesis and study of verses 18 and 19, which are going to give us God's power in redemption. Okay, so that's where we'll pick it up next week, and we're going to end it this week. But of course, before we end, we're going to sing. We're going to end with a song with a joyful noise. So if you'll stand. We're going to sing song number